So as I was sharing, when I sent the title of my talk to Ashley, I had what Brene Brown refers to as a vulnerability hangover, because I started to think that it's just too provocative to imply that development officers would ever stop and think about their relationship with their employers, or their relationship with donors, or the relationship with beneficiaries. And it felt like I had gone out on a limb a little bit. But then as I did my research and I reflected on experiences that I've had and that my colleagues have had, I realized, like, right now is the perfect time to have this conversation. So I'm going to take you on my journey of thinking about why this title is perfectly fine for today. So I'm sitting in this exquisitely appointed office before an enormous solicitation. And my BlackBerry starts going off, which Tina, when we worked together, you know, that was back in the day with BlackBerries. So I just wanted to kind of orient this anecdote in terms of it was a long time ago. And as I entered into the donor's office, that was like very Devil Wears Prada. And I'll never forget this ginormous ashtray that she had sitting on her desk. And what that symbolized for me was that social norms didn't apply to her, and maybe even laws at that point in time didn't apply to her. And just that object in itself was so incredibly intimidating. But then when she led with, "Had I known it would just be you, I wouldn't have taken this meeting." And this was because my dean was supposed to be with me, but she wasn't because her flight was delayed. So, "Had I known it would just be you, I wouldn't have taken this meeting." You know, it puts a person in a particular headspace, right? And it's probably not the feeling of like, I'm about to crush this solicitation. And worse than that, what I actually heard, I was 27 or so, was, "You are a flea on the dog of life and you must leave now." And now at this point in my career, like, I can process all this stuff. You know, I know that it's not me, but back then I thought, what could I have done differently to have been treated more like the trusted partner that even then I felt like I was, and less like a flea? You know, I took that on for sure. But now I have enough evidence after, you know, all these years and tens of thousands of conversations with donors. Like, I've got enough evidence that this is not about me. A donor who lacks self-awareness it's their thing. And I can guarantee our earlier career colleagues, it's not you either. And I want to be sure that you all know that, because I feel like one of the reasons why I'm still super happy and super excited about my job every day is because I understand that these power imbalances exist. And I've learned how to process a lot of them, not all of them, because this is going to be a lifelong journey, but a lot of them, so that I'm still at my best when I'm working with donors and I'm working with my employers. But, you know, this stuff exists in our sector and we have to process it. We're mission-driven professionals. There are times for like grinning and bearing it, of course. And it's plenty subjective. So sometimes we're not 100% sure that if we were to share this with others, we would get the sympathy or empathy that we need. So really, we don't talk about this very much. We don't talk about the power imbalances very frequently. But the truth is that we all have feelings too, and they do matter, right? Whether you're early career or seasoned veteran, how we process our relationships at work is vital to our well-being, as well as our great work with donors. So to help support that professional well-being and the health of our organizations, what I'm proposing is that it's time to rethink how we navigate our relationships with donors, our nonprofits, and beneficiaries. I'm going to walk you through a few concepts that might give you food for thought as we launch into the future post-COVID, which I think the only thing that's surefire about it is that things are going to change, right? It's definitely not going to be exactly like it was before the pandemic. And chances are the rate of change is going to be very fast. So being grounded and having the right mindset, being able to process these power imbalances is really important. I think more so now than ever. I have a question for all of you to consider. The question is, why do you do this work? Why are you in this industry? Good, bad, ugly, joy, happiness, sense of accomplishment, like all those things mixed together. At the end of the day, why are you in it? And for me, it's the promise of a better world and delivering on that, ideally at scale. And then there's another piece of it, which is that through my work with donors, I'm helping people self-actualize. And that makes me feel really good about the work that I do. So the piece about delivering on a promise of a better world, I think about, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a professor, I don't run a nonprofit. There's only one thing that I know how to do well that can help solve some of society's most intractable problems. By being a fundraiser, I can indeed help us achieve a better world. And that means everything to me on a daily basis. I've heard colleagues talk about this. I think lots of us on this call have a really noble reason for being in this industry. In addition, there's something else that I think is so meaningful. And this is my point number 2 here. Philanthropy is a very unique human experience. And we get to offer donors access to some of the most pleasurable and joyous emotions. Giving back can change a person. And I'm sure we've all seen this. It connects us to our sense of purpose, one of the ingredients in happiness. It triggers happy brain chemistry like dopamine and serotonin and oxytocin. It unites donors with something bigger than themselves. So in addition to helping the nonprofits we love, we're also a conduit for our donors to have these totally unique and self-actualizing experiences. And that for me is incredibly motivating. I'm going to let Aristotle put the finest of points on this. To give away money is an easy matter in any man's power. But to decide to whom to give it and how large and when, and for what purpose and how, is neither in any man's power nor an easy matter. And this sense of purpose that I get from my work, right? Pursuing the answer to Simon Sinek's question of what is your why? This is the reason why it can be so destabilizing when things go wrong at our institutions, right? Which they do. It's unavoidable. There are going to be interruptions and challenges, and in some cases, even scandals, things that happen that cause us like scratch our head, like, am I in the right job? Am I in the right industry? Is my, purpose of being in development big enough and noble enough to get me through some of these moments where I'm not quite sure. And I think these emotions are entirely normal. But again, it's an example of we just don't talk about it that much. The definition for this kind of soup of all sorts of different emotions is cognitive dissonance. It's the state of having inconsistent thoughts, beliefs, or attitudes, especially related to behavioral decisions and attitude change. Cognitive dissonance is an exhausting state of mind. It causes psychological stress. When you have this big ball of inconsistent thoughts and feelings, it's, development officers stay up at night, they cry, they have angst, and wonder how is it that they're going to put themselves out there with their donors during, when there's a crisis going on. And this is not to be like a Debbie Downer moment, but I'm just going to share some of the examples of things that cause me, at least in higher education, to sometimes wonder. These are just a few examples. So an $852 million settlement for sex abuse of hundreds of women by a healthcare employee at USC, which was on top of the $150 million that was already paid out. So $1 billion changing hands due to sex abuse scandal at a university has to make a development officer stop and think, am I okay with this? Like, am I in the right place? And then, the other things that happen, they just are they're part of the cost of doing business, working in, all of the institutions that we work with, whether it's a small nonprofit or a big, multinational conglomerate of the higher education, industrial complex. Things happen, right? So you've got civil rights violations. You've got our role in the student loan crisis. You've got university presidents stepping down. You've got the occasional challenge that come along with Division I athletics. So in my case, working for universities and academic medical centers, I've always felt that just by going to work in the morning, I'm helping deliver on that promise of a better world. And I think lots of us feel that way. So when these crummy things happen, you feel confused. I doubt myself. I doubt the institution. It just does not feel good. So knowing that I had all these questions, but not as many answers as one would hope for, I reached out to some of my very favorite and most respected leaders in higher education fundraising, one of whom is here today, Joan. And here's what they shared for advice. Remember the big picture, the impact your work is having on society in general, rather than the institution in particular. And then there's no place is going to align all the time. And then there's a little bit tougher love version of the advice, which is our job is to promote the institution we work for. If we disagree, we have to decide whether to support leadership's position or move on and do something else. So this is an example of like the spectrum of advice. And I think really points to, we all have our own work to do with this. You could take any of this advice, at its face value and go one direction or go the next. But I have no idea what's right for you. But for me, this helped me think about, just making some of the options more concrete for myself. So that's a lot about our relationships with employers. Now, just as we have cognitive dissonance, and it can be pretty complicated and multifactorial with our institutions, we also sometimes create some of that with our donors. Some of this is due to this phenomenon that I recently learned about called the bubble of positivity. So this comes from the book Giving Done Right by Paul Buchanan of the Center for Effective Philanthropy. And it made so much sense to me. The bubble of positivity is when we wrap donors in this like cocoon of positive, happy, wonderful, joyous experiences. And we may downplay certain realities of gift administration, impact, effectiveness. And we probably put pressure on ourselves and others likely to be delightful and share wonderful information and happy thoughts, even when things aren't going so great. Like, it's a challenge to find that line of being completely transparent when things may not be going as ideally as certainly the donor would expect, in part because we set that expectation our very own selves as development officers. Thought I would share a story of when the bubble of positivity completely backfired on me. I'm guessing that most people on this call have had at least a very mild version of this, if not something as dramatic. So back long time ago, I closed a gift for a recruiting scholarship. And the intention was that this would go out to community college students to help with the process of transferring to a large land grant institution, which, as we all know, is very, very fraught. There are all sorts of problems. And one could argue that money is the last thing that is going to fix all this. But regardless, it was aligned. It was a great gift, right? It was aligned with our college's mission. It was aligned with the donor's mission. And there's all these plans for how it was going to make this great impact on the students. So super excited, right? And of course, we treated it like the match made in heaven that it was. But then this story kind of writes itself, since you already know like the tone, but the money wasn't spent, right? We've been there before. Go back to the donor and thank goodness I had accumulated enough goodwill with all of the happiness that, you know, we could kind of reconcile that first year of the money not being spent. And she was okay with it. But then the second year, it wasn't spent. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to start doing some internal advocacy to make sure that we don't have this situation again. So of course, as development officers, we don't have legitimate authority to make things happen, but we can influence our colleagues. And so I started a little bit of an internal campaign, meetings and memos and promises and handshake deals and you know, the whole thing to make sure that the money would get allocated. But it wasn't. And so then we went back to the donor and shared, you know, obviously like the reasons, which sound like excuses, but they all are legitimate, but still the money's not been spent. The mission, the purpose of the gift is not being achieved, not even remotely. So we're already in like repair zone with the donor. And then the third year comes around and the money's still not spent. So now things get super awkward. And for me, I had gone so far all in with ensuring that the donor was doing okay at that point, and that the university was indeed going to spend the money. And I'd squandered pretty much every iota of personal capital that I had with, you know, all the people in this puzzle. Losing sleep, you know, had a hard time looking at myself in the mirror. I mean, I took it this really super hard, but that didn't matter. It didn't matter like how sad I was about it. Like the donor was aggrieved. The university was fairly, to be honest, unapologetic. And so we went down the path that you could imagine us going in, which is the donor started making noises about removing us from our estate. And this is just what happens, right? Like if we aren't the forthright diplomats we always want to be, if we surround our donors in this bubble of positivity, these things are going to happen. It doesn't mean that we should, you know, predispose our donors to being unhappy by any means, but there's a happy medium here. And in my mild defense of putting that donor in her bubble of positivity, this is sort of an extension of donor-centered fundraising. And with all due respect to Penelope Burke, who popularized DCF, this is probably a good time to rethink some of the notions. And and here's why, this is my opinion, is that there are side effects of DCF that we all have seen and experienced and probably would like to avoid. One is this, overwhelming ironclad cocoon of everything's wonderful. Another is that DCF does promote really specific gift designations. And that's in part because that's how we can show impact to donors. It's not a bad thing per se. The intention is beautiful, but the outcome is having these overly specific gifts that don't make as good use of the philanthropy as we could. It also does skew resource allocation toward donors. And again, it's not that that's wrong. Of course, we need to have excellent stewardship and demonstrate impact, but it is a stop and think moment of where we put our resources, where we put our time, are we putting it in the right place? And I'm just suggesting that we have that thought process. We look at it through a slightly different lens. I think it can skew the power imbalance ultimately. And that's the issue that has been on my mind, is between the donors, the nonprofit mission, and the beneficiaries and the development officer, how is the power distributed? So I've been thinking about donor-centered fundraising. This is just a fun comment on the bubble of positivity. So, we've probably heard donors with like dry wit say things to us like, everyone's being really so nice to me all of a sudden since I made this gift. And then the classic remark that I love so much is, and it seems like I just became smarter, funnier, and better looking since I made this gift. And as charming as that is, and I do get a kick out of it, and I love that our donors are self-aware or just generally aware enough to sometimes recognize what's happening. I do think that we, should be cautious about it. I'm going to take this one step further to comment on how the power imbalance between us and donors impacts our psyche. When the ashtray lady told me that she didn't want to see me and that I was nothing, I didn't push back. I didn't want to turn her off. I know my job is, as pointed out by one of the leaders that I surveyed, sometimes our job is just to represent our organizations. So in that context, I thought, okay, well, I grin and bear it. And that might have been the right call, but it also might not have. And decades later, I know for sure I've sublimated my own well-being so that donors can have the latitude that makes them feel comfortable. And again, I'm not suggesting that that is wrong as a blanket statement, but I am suggesting that it's important to think about it at least, especially for those of us who are leaders and have early career colleagues who look up to us. That's been one of the most important motivators to me in the last, few years, is knowing, in particular, young women are looking up to me and they're watching how I interface with donors and they're seeing, how that looks, how that feels, how that reverberates. So for me, it's been a really enlightening process to think about my relationship with donors and how earlier career colleagues are learning from me. I asked some of our dear colleagues again for advice on how development officers can approach the power dynamic in ways that are safe and healthy. A couple of comments were, it's important to find your voice and value your role as a representative and advocate for your organization. You're not an order taker. You are a champion for change. I love that so much. We are champions for change. Remember why you are in this work and what impact you're helping facilitate by securing these gifts. Always remember that you're a professional. Feel empowered to push back and attempt to center your work around aligning institutional values with the donor passion and values. I hope this advice is helpful to you. I know it was helpful to me. All right, now I want to tackle a really big topic. And I'll cover just a sliver of all that we could discuss, but I hope it's helpful as a starting point. I've chosen to approach the next section about how we relate to beneficiaries through the lens of race and philanthropy. And before I do that, I want to point out that I'm a work in progress. And I acknowledge that as a cisgendered white woman, I am still learning the immense privileges that have come my way just because of the color of my skin. No matter how I achieve whatever I achieve, I've always had a leg up because of the color of my skin. And I'll be learning about this for the rest of my life and trying to be the change agent we need. And I also know that that'll never be enough. So all this is to say that I'm going to talk about race and philanthropy next, and I will get things wrong. But this is where my head is at right now. And I very much welcome feedback and guidance after the talk about how I can better address issues like this in the future. These are heavy topics, no? So I'm going to focus on three things: white saviorism, expressions of gratitude, and ethical storytelling. And I know that we all know what white saviorism is, but I think it's helpful to create a shared understanding. So I'm going to share the definition. White saviorism is a worldview that regards white people as saviors and other groups as needing to be saved by them. It's a form of false generosity. It maintains and embodies white supremacy. It frames the white outsider as the savior and hero, and the people of color as too oppressed, too downtrodden, too powerless to help themselves. I don't think I need to step us through how this shows up in philanthropy, but just in case, at least in my world, I work with lots and lots of white donors, many of whom are making gifts or want to make gifts specifically to benefit BIPOC individuals. And I think it's imperative that we manage not only the perception, but the reality of white saviorism in this dynamic. It's very tricky, and again, no answers, mostly questions, but thinking about things through this lens and with this in mind, hopefully it will help us adjust so that this part of the power dynamic isn't as damaging or insidious as it can be. I want to talk a little bit about expressions of gratitude and what that can look like. And I'll also talk about ethical storytelling. So how do we express gratitude to our donors, and how do we ask our beneficiaries to do that? Systemic racism exacerbates the power imbalance between donors and BIPOC beneficiaries, independent of whether white saviorism is involved. It's important to consider whether we are putting beneficiaries in a subservient position by asking them to express gratitude in a way that we've decided is the right way to express gratitude, or that our donors have asked us that they would like to have gratitude expressed to them. I think it's important to ask our beneficiaries what's comfortable for them so that they can share gratitude in a way that's comfortable for them, in their comfort zone, that's in integrity. And it's not going to happen just by us, whether it's the development officers or the donor relations unit or whatever, thinking about and deciding ourselves what's right, or if it's because we're responding to what our donors are interested in. I think there is a missing piece here, a missing link that we can fix by working with in the case of a scholarship recipient, working with those scholarship recipients to ensure that we're asking them to do what, makes sense for them. Here's another example of how we can help. Ethical storytelling. So this information I hadn't thought of, just another example of where I am on this journey. Derek Cruz, who works with me at OSUF, attended a presentation by Calliope Glaros of Philanthropy Without Borders. And I think, are they here on the call today? They might be. At any rate, totally mind-blowing and important and informative. And it has changed the way that me and my team approach storytelling. So here's the issue, is that oftentimes to make the argument for support, we tell a story of a disadvantaged person who can be helped through giving. And oftentimes these disadvantaged subjects are BIPOC people. And donors tend to be white. So it's important to let recipients have a voice in how our stories are told, how their stories are told. It's not our story. It's not the donor's story. It's their story. And the litmus test example, I think, is so brilliant. In the case of a scholarship recipient, how would you speak of the student or the opportunity if they were sitting a table away at an event? Would you talk about them as disadvantaged, downtrodden, or in need of a donor to kind of swoop in and make everything work? So here's a moment for reflection. Through the lens of what I've just been talking about with white saviorism and expressions of gratitude and ethical storytelling, if you look at these images, what's the story you would tell? And how would you ask whoever the beneficiary is? How would you ask them to express gratitude? And if a story about a gift crosses your desk and you're asked to edit it or share input or rethink it, how would you do that in a way that promoted ethical storytelling? And I can tell you that in our team, we've already, there are like 3 publications that we all blessed or kind of sort of wrote that were published and went out into the world, that when we looked at it through the lens of ethical storytelling, we were pretty mortified. We promoted a massive power imbalance by representing beneficiaries in a way as though money was the thing that caused them to be successful, or that was standing in the way of their success or lack of. And of course, that money comes from donors who stereotypically, at my institution, they're white. And so we're promoting this power imbalance. And all I'm suggesting is that, we give it more thought before we do that. I've covered a lot of territory, and some of it is pretty sensitive. Before I conclude, I want to talk a little bit about mindset and psychological safety. So in all of this, right, power, institutional missteps, bubble of positivity, race and philanthropy, it's helpful for all of us to understand and nurture a mindset that helps us stay clear on why we do this, why we really, really do this. And if this is the reason why we do this, what we need to rethink in order to support it. So in my case, if I'm excited about helping deliver on the promise of a better world, what's embedded in that is not promoting, not promoting, let's just call it power imbalance. It's all related. You can't separate it. At least I can't now. And as leaders, we need to create that psychological safety. We need to create a culture so we can all talk about power imbalances without stigma and without, fear of being judged or retaliated or just made uncomfortable in those conversations. I'm a big fan of having a growth mindset. I think it's something that, we've got to nurture. It doesn't happen without it being a practice. Just a shared definition of growth mindset nurtures a passion for self-improvement as well as resilience that is essential to achieving significant accomplishments. There's no question, none of us wake up in the morning to achieve insignificant accomplishments. This is why we're here. And having a growth mindset can help keep all of this in context and help keep all of it in a healthy space. Here are some tips. And I think these all apply in one way or another to what we've talked about so far today. One is embracing imperfection. And I kind of think about that in the realm of gift administration. Being able to admit that it's not perfect, we may not be able to make it perfect. Finding a way to embrace imperfection and communicating in a way that everybody feels comfortable with. Words and thoughts, the words and thoughts that we have in our head, as well as the words and thought that we put out into the world. I've heard that we're always telling ourselves stories. So why don't we make them good ones? Not seeking quite so much approval. That's a tricky one for me. Being authentic. Cultivating a sense of purpose. We know that that's essential to our self-actualization. And really embracing that not yet is okay. Regarding psychological safety, and this is really for those of us who have the ability to create and influence culture, but it also takes place in one-on-one. Psychological safety allows for risk-taking. It allows for speaking your mind, creativity, and sticking your neck out. I think of this example of on one hand, there's just solo jumping out of the plane and hoping everything is fine and you're pretty alone in this journey versus doing it in tandem with somebody who's got your back, who's certainly not there to judge you, who's supportive and open and certainly going to listen to anything you say. Psychological safety is fragile. It's not something that we can just hope for. It takes work to implement it, but it's essential, especially for success in uncertain, interdependent environments, which we are entering into a very uncertain environment. So a couple of tips on this that I gleaned from, most of you are probably aware of that research on teams that Google did, studies at UNC, UW, and the Chronicle of Philanthropy. Just a couple of tips that I found to be the most accessible. Speaking human to human, it's not about who did what, it's about respect and competence and autonomy, recognizing these deeper needs for those types of conversations, knowing that everyone has beliefs and perspectives and opinions just like you do. anticipating reactions. So approaching difficult conversations by preparing for likely reactions. And that to me seems very operationable. It can be operationalized. And then being curious, like no blaming. Blaming leads to defensiveness and disengagement. Being curious is an antidote to blame. It acknowledges that you don't have all the facts, and it encourages dialogue. As we move into this brave new world, I hope that you will bring some of these concepts into your thought process and your leadership skills. I hope that we can honor one another's experiences while navigating the complicated world of philanthropy. The opportunity to deliver on the promise of a better world is immense, and I hope you'll join me in this journey. Thank you. I appreciate your attention and presence and willingness to think through some of these complicated and loaded subjects.